The perfect Saturday has a sound. It's the confident sizzle of a well-marbled ribeye hitting hot grates, the distant, non-committal hum of a lawnmower someone else is pushing, and the gentle thwack of my garden trowel hitting pay dirt. It is a symphony of suburban peace, a delicate ecosystem of calm that I, Leo, have spent years curating. It is most definitely not the sound of orthopedic sandals crunching gravel with the rhythmic, soul-crushing fury of a metronome set to impending doom. But that's the sound I heard, and I knew, with the certainty of a man who's had his recycling bin measured for non-compliance, the lid was 1/4 of an inch too open, that my perfect Saturday was about to be cited for a violation. I didn't even have to look up. The shadow that fell over me was devoid of warmth, a harbinger of bureaucratic nonsense. Leo. The voice was flat, sharp, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone who has just found a typo in the universe and intends to file a formal complaint about it. I sighed, plunging my trowel into the soft earth one last time before sitting back on my heels. I pasted on my most pleasant, least incriminating smile and looked up at the source of my suburban discontent, Carol, the undisputed queen of the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association. She stood there in her usual battle regalia, a beige pantsuit that seemed to absorb all surrounding joy, a visor that shielded her eyes from the sun but not from perceived infractions, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy text. She looked from me to the towering stalks behind me, her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. "Carol," I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness I normally reserve for coaxing my Wi-Fi router back to life. "A delight, as always. On your afternoon patrol, I see. Keeping our little slice of heaven harmonious." "We need to talk about your stalks," she said, her eyes narrowing. She refused to call them by their proper name, as if acknowledging them as flowers would grant them some kind of diplomatic immunity. "My sunflowers?" I gestured dramatically with my dirt-caked hand. "The glorious, sun-worshipping beacons of joy that grace our humble community garden? What about them? Are they too happy? Is their particular shade of yellow not on the HOA-approved color palette?" Carol did not do banter. Banter to her was a verbal infraction, a deviation from the clear, concise language of rules and regulations. "I'm referring to a flagrant violation of Bylaw 7, Section 4, Subsection B, Flora Height, and Aesthetic Cohesion. It's a foundational tenet of the Harmony Creek Covenant, as you well know." I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my already ruined shorts. I'm a good foot taller than her, but somehow her posture, a masterwork of rigid indignation, made me feel like a schoolboy caught with a spitball. "Remind me, Carol, my copy of the 800-page HOA Bible is currently being used to press a particularly stubborn geranium." "All non-shrubbery plantings," she recited, her voice a monotone drone, "must not exceed a maximum height of 36 inches from the established soil line." I stared at her. Then I stared at my sunflowers. The lead stalk, a magnificent specimen I had nicknamed the Jolly Green Giant, was pushing a glorious 6'7". 36 inches? Carol, that's not a sunflower, that's a sad, depressed daisy. These are titans. They are majestic. They are a testament to the life-giving power of the sun and premium-grade fertilizer. "They are non-compliant," she snapped. Her eyes darted over to the adjacent plot, which belonged to Brenda, a sweet-as-pie grandmother who grew prize-winning petunias. And they cast a shadow over Brenda's petunias. I glanced over. Brenda's plot was a riot of pink and purple, and the flowers looked healthier than I did. In fact, they seemed to be enjoying the respite from the blistering afternoon sun. Brenda herself, who was tending to her roses a few plots down, saw us looking and gave me a cheerful, blissfully unaware wave. "Brenda doesn't seem to mind," I countered. "In fact, her petunias look fantastic. I think they're grateful. They probably have their own tiny little flower union, and they've negotiated for better shade conditions. They told me so this morning." My sarcasm was a foreign language to Carol. She produced a metal measuring tape from a holster on her belt, the kind a carpenter might carry. It unspooled with a menacing shyank. She marched over to the jolly green giant and meticulously, almost reverently, measured its height. She held the tape taut, squinted, and then stood back. 79 inches, she declared, her voice filled with the grim satisfaction of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "That is a 43-inch violation per plant." I blinked. "Per plant? Are you writing a ticket for each individual sunflower? Because that seems a little excessive, even for you. Are they going to get points on their permanent record?" "I am issuing a formal warning," she announced, scribbling furiously on a pre-printed form on her clipboard. "You have until Monday at 9 a.m. to bring these beacons of joy into compliance. After that, the HOA will be forced to take corrective action." She tore the sheet off the clipboard and handed it to me. It felt as official and unwelcome as a summons. "What, precisely, does corrective action entail?" I asked, a dark curiosity blooming in my chest. "Are you going to send in a tactical pruning team? A tiny little SWAT unit with shears and hedge trimmers?" "Just comply, Leo," she said, her voice low and final. She turned and marched off, her orthopedic sandals crunching with a victorious rhythm. I watched her go, the ridiculous slip of paper flapping in my hand. I looked down at my beautiful, towering 43-inch over the legal limit sunflowers. Then I looked over at my best friend and next-door neighbor, Dave, who had been watching the entire exchange from his own garden plot while pretending to be deeply fascinated by a tomato. He had the acting skills of a ficus, but I appreciated the effort. He ambled over, a grin spreading slowly across his face. "Man, she really hates your stalks." "She hates joy, Dave. She hates things that are taller than her." He looked from the citation in my hand to the retreating form of Carol. "So, you gonna let her win? Gonna chop down the big guys?" I looked at my sunflowers, their heavy heads facing the sun, oblivious to their own criminality. I thought about Carol's smug, triumphant face. A slow, mischievous grin began to form on my own. "Dave, my friend," I said, crumbling the citation in my fist, "the battle hasn't even begun." Carol's fundamental mistake wasn't her rigid, almost fanatical adherence to the rules. It was her complete and utter failure to comprehend the mind of a man who possessed a graphic design degree, a recently purchased label maker, and an entire weekend to kill. She wanted compliance. What she was going to get was art. Petty, glorious, passive-aggressive art. My garage became our war room. By Sunday afternoon, it smelled of fertilizer, spray paint, and rebellion. I'd dragged my big whiteboard out from my office, and Dave and I were brainstorming like two advertising executives pitching a campaign for the world's most obnoxious product. At the top of the board, in big, bold letters, I'd written, "Operation Annoy Carol." "Okay, hit me," I said, uncapping a dry erase marker. "No bad ideas." "Oh, I have bad ideas," Dave said, his eyes gleaming with a mad scientist light. He was a software engineer, a man whose solution to most problems involved either writing code or buying a gadget from a Kickstarter campaign that would never actually ship. Idea 1. We install a tiny, motion-activated speaker behind each sunflower. Every time she gets within 5 feet, it plays a recording of you whispering, "I'm watching you, Carol." "Tempting, but too direct," I said, pacing in front of the board. We need plausible deniability. The goal is to make her question her own sanity, not just my maturity. We need to be subtle, annoyingly subtle. Our first project was born from a trip to the craft store. Googly eyes. We bought a value pack of the largest, most absurdly sized googly eyes they had. Back in the garage, we carefully, almost surgically, affixed one giant, wobbling eye to the center of each sunflower head. Suddenly, they weren't just towering over the garden. They were staring, judgmentally. It was beautiful. Next came the signage. This was my area of expertise. I fired up my laptop and designed a series of miniature, professionally printed protest signs. The fonts were crisp, the kerning was perfect. I laminated them for weather resistance and mounted them on popsicle sticks. By mid-afternoon, our sunflower army was armed with slogans. Height is not a crime. Down with Big Pruner. Grow the revolution. I'm with stupid. Complete with a little arrow that I planned to aim directly at Carol's house. And my personal favorite, a masterpiece of pointed sarcasm. 36 inches is perfectly average, Carol. Some of us are just blessed. As I was admiring my handiwork, Dave, a man who cannot see a situation without wanting to add a layer of unnecessary technology to it, cleared his throat. This is great, he said. Visually, it's a strong statement, but we're missing a key component. And what's that? Surveillance, he whispered, as if the garage might be bugged. For, security, to make sure no one correctively actions, our art installation before showtime. He reached into his gadget bag and produced a drone the size of a large beetle. The Bumblebug 5000, 4K camera, near-silent rotors, and a 30-minute flight time. Stealth mode. Dave, is this thing even legal? I asked, peering at the tiny device. It's under 250 grams, my friend, he said proudly. The FAA can't touch us. The HOA, however, well, that's a different story. Let's not get caught. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up our masterpiece. Under the cover of the setting sun, we tiptoed into the community garden like a pair of suburban ninjas. We planted the signs, angling them for maximum visibility from Carol's kitchen window. We adjusted the googly eyes so they stared directly at her property. Then Dave calibrated his drone, which immediately got tangled in his hair, requiring a frantic, silent struggle to free it. Finally, everything was in place. It was magnificent. The garden no longer looked like a garden. It looked like a Muppet protest rally. The chapter culminates on Monday morning at 8:55 a.m. Me and Dave are crouched behind a large azalea bush, the kind of hiding spot that probably offers no real concealment but feels clandestine. Dave is piloting the drone, which is hovering silently over the garden, feeding a crystal-clear video stream to his phone. My heart is pounding with the thrill of petty defiance. Right on schedule, at precisely 9:01 a.m., Carol's front door opens. She marches out, clipboard in hand, ready to enforce the law. She reaches my plot of land and stops dead in her tracks. We watch on Dave's phone as her face cycles through a beautiful, silent symphony of human emotion. First, utter confusion, as if her brain cannot process the data it's receiving. Then, disbelief, her eyes darting from the googly eyes to the tiny protest signs. Then, a flicker of deep, profound irritation. And finally, her face settles into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her knuckles, clutching the clipboard, are white. She doesn't say a word. She doesn't consult her bylaws. She just turns on her heel with military precision and marches back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Dave lowers his phone, a look of awe on his face. Dude, did we win? He whispers. I shake my head, a slow smile spreading across my face. No, I reply, my eyes fixed on her front door. That was the finding out phase. We are now rapidly approaching the messing around part of the equation. The silence from Carol's house is more unnerving than any lecture. We know she's planning a counter-move. On the drone feed, we can see her silhouette in the window, a dark shape against the light. She seems to be holding something long and thin, something that looks disturbingly like a garden hose. There are certain moments in life that unfold in cinematic slow motion. A first kiss, a dropped wedding cake. The instant you realize you've hit reply all on an email meant for one person. And, as it turns out, the sight of a middle-aged woman in a beige pantsuit sprinting from her house with a garden hose, a look of righteous fury on her face, and the clear intention of committing herbicide on a grand scale. My drone-piloting, gadget-loving neighbor and I were about to have a front-row seat to the dumbest, most waterlogged apocalypse I'd ever witnessed. It started on the drone's eye view, playing out on the small screen of Dave's phone. Carol's front door burst open with a force that suggested she'd used a battering ram. "We have movement," Dave hissed, his voice taking on the tone of a war correspondent. "Suspect is on the move. I repeat, suspect is on the move. She's armed, with what appears to be a 5/8-inch heavy-duty vinyl hose and a 7-pattern spray nozzle. What's she gonna do, Dave?" I whispered back, my eyes glued to the screen. "Give them a stern misting? Bore them into submission with a fine spray?" My question was answered when Carol, instead of connecting the hose to her own house, marched directly to the main spigot for the entire community garden. It was a thick, industrial-grade tap with a big wheel handle designed to deliver a much higher volume of water than any standard residential spigot. She spun the wheel with a grunt of effort. Then she strode toward my plot, the hose slithering behind her like a green python. She didn't even bother with a preamble, no final warning, no last chance citation. She just raised the nozzle, which was set to jet, and let loose. A blast of water hit my lead sunflower, the jolly green giant, with the force of a fire hose. It wasn't a watering, it was an assault. The googly eye was ripped from its center and went flying. One of the larger leaves tore. "Man down!" I yelled, forgetting to whisper. "We've lost an eye!" I couldn't just watch on a screen. I jumped out from behind the azalea bush, my cover blown. "Carol, what in the hell are you doing?" My voice seemed to break a spell over the neighborhood. Other gardeners, drawn by the sound of rushing water and my shouting, started to emerge from their homes. Brenda, the petunia lady, appeared on her porch, her hand over her mouth. The Millers, Tom and Sarah, a young couple who grew organic kale with an almost religious devotion, came jogging over. Carol was undeterred. If anything, the audience fueled her. "I'm restoring aesthetic cohesion," she screamed over the violent hiss of the water. "These plants are a menace to the community's visual harmony." "You're going to kill them," I shouted back, taking a step toward her. "That's my private property. You can't just do that." My defiance was like gasoline on a fire. Her rage, contained for so long behind a dam of bylaws and passive aggression, burst forth in a torrent. Her rampage expanded. She swung the hose around wildly, no longer targeting just my sunflowers. "They're all non-compliant," she shrieked, a wild, crazed look in her eyes. "This whole garden has become a hotbed of unregulated growth and anarchy." The powerful jet of water swept across the garden like a scythe. Brenda's prize-winning petunias were flattened in an instant, their delicate pink and purple heads plastered to the mud. The Millers' perfect, neat rows of organic kale were blasted with dirt and water, turning their superfood paradise into a swamp. Tomato cages were knocked over. Delicate herbs were uprooted. It was a massacre. The scene descended into pure chaos. People were shouting. I was trying to reason with her, to get her to just stop. "Carol, for God's sake, stop. You're flooding everything," I pleaded. "It's a deep soak," she yelled back, a triumphant, unhinged look on her face. "The soil was parched! I'm helping!" She had now completely lost it. She marched to one of the central beds, shoved the nozzle of the hose deep into the soil, and just left it there, gushing water at full blast. The raised bed, contained by its wooden planks, began to fill up like a bathtub. The water overflowed, spilling into the next bed, and the next. The entire community garden, a patchwork of individual plots, was slowly, horrifyingly, turning into a single, massive, interconnected mud puddle. Finally, her rage apparently spent, she wrenched the hose out of the ground, dropped it, and shut off the spigot. She stood there, breathing heavily, splattered with mud. She surveyed her work, a smug, deeply satisfied look on her face. "There," she said, her voice filled with a sense of accomplishment. "Order has been restored." The assembled gardeners stood in stunned, horrified silence, looking at the devastation. Little rivers of brown water trickled down the pathways. Brenda was on the verge of tears, her hand still over her mouth as she stared at her flattened flowers. Tom Miller looked like he'd just witnessed a murder. My anger, which had been simmering at a low boil, went supernova. I wanted to scream at her, to call the cops, to do something. But as I looked at the ridiculous, ankle-deep lake where our beautiful garden used to be, a strange thing happened. The white-hot anger began to cool, replaced by something else entirely. A spark. A gloriously stupid, beautifully oversized idea. I looked at the standing water. I looked at Dave, who was, to his credit, still filming the whole thing with his phone, his mouth hanging open in shock. I walked over to him and said quietly, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across my face, "You know what they say, Dave. You can't fight water with fire." Dave just stared at me, confused. "What?" My grin widened. "You fight water with a bigger, better, and much, much louder way to move water." I looked at the flooded garden, the distraught faces of my neighbors, and the smug visage of our local despot. The idea crystallized in my mind, perfect and pristine in its absolute absurdity. I was going to get a fire engine. Every great movement in history begins with a meeting in a stuffy room. The Founding Fathers had Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The Avengers have that weirdly sterile, glass-walled conference room in their tower. We had my living room, which currently smelled like a freshly plowed swamp, and our ranks consisted of a heartbroken grandma, a kale-obsessed hipster couple, a tech nerd holding a drone, and me, a guy whose primary motivation had officially transitioned from mild annoyance to weaponized spite. It wasn't exactly the Yalta Conference, but it was a start. The core group was assembled on my couch, a makeshift council of the wronged. Brenda was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "My prize-winning petunias," she sniffled. "They look like soggy tissue paper. The judges from the county fair are coming next week." Tom Miller was pacing back and forth on my area rug, leaving muddy footprints I knew I'd have to deal with later. "That's 6 months of composting down the drain. 6 months of nurturing our soil microbiome. It's all been washed away. We have anaerobic conditions now. Do you know what that means?" "It means our garden smells like a fart," Dave offered. Tom shot him a death glare. I let them vent for a few minutes, letting the righteous indignation build. It was the fuel I would need to get them on board with what I was about to propose. I stood up and clapped my hands together, a gesture I hoped looked more leader-like than manic. "Friends, neighbors, fellow victims of horticultural terrorism," I began, channeling my inner Winston Churchill. "We have been wronged. Our soil has been sullied. Our kale has been compromised. Our petunias have perished. The question is not why. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Sarah Miller, Tom's wife, who had been silently fuming, spoke up. "We file a complaint with the HOA, a formal one. We'll get a petition. We'll document everything." I shook my head. "Sarah, Carol is the complaint department of the HOA. She's the head of the Architectural Review Committee. That's like asking a wolf to investigate a missing chicken. He'll conduct a thorough investigation of his own stomach and find nothing." "A lawsuit, then," Tom said, stopping his pacing. "Small claims court, for the damages." "Too slow," I said, waving my hand dismissively. "Too expensive. And what do we get? A check for a few $100 in 6 months? No, that's not justice. That's an administrative process. Justice delayed is justice denied. We need something more immediate, more symbolic." I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. "We are going to pump the water out of that garden," I said, my voice low and serious. "And we are going to do it in a way that no one in Harmony Creek Estates will ever forget." I paused for dramatic effect, letting the words hang in the air. Dave leaned forward, intrigued. "We," I said, enunciating each word, "are getting a fire engine." Silence. Brenda blinked slowly, as if I'd just started speaking in tongues. Tom Miller stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, looking at me like I'd just suggested we solve the problem by genetically engineering flying monkeys to attack Carol's house, which, to be fair, had been my plan B. But Dave, my glorious gadget-loving enabler, got it instantly. His face lit up. "Yes," he exclaimed, slapping his knee. "A pumper truck. The suction power would be incredible. We could probably use a hard-sleeve suction hose to get the best vacuum. A Hale 1500 GPM pump could drain that thing in minutes. We could live-stream the whole thing. It would be epic." Brenda finally found her voice. "A fire engine? Oh my! That sounds awfully loud, Leo." "That's the point, Brenda," I said, my energy rising. "This isn't just about water removal. We're not just fixing a drainage problem. We're making a statement. We're sending a message. We're telling Carol and the entire HOA board that we will not be silenced by her aquatic tyranny. We will meet her overwhelming force with even more overwhelming and, frankly, hilarious force." I started pacing again, painting them a picture with my words. I described the visual. A massive, gleaming red fire engine, its lights flashing, tastefully of course, pulling up to our humble suburban street. The powerful roar of the diesel engine. The professional, efficient, and very public draining of the swamp she had so proudly created. An act of community service so over the top it bordered on performance art. Tom Miller was shaking his head. It's insane." His wife, Sarah, had a strange, dreamy look on her face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But I can't do it alone," I said, bringing it home. "I need a team, a crew." I looked at each of them in turn, like a general recruiting for a suicide mission. "Dave, I need you on tech and logistics. Find me a fire engine. I don't care how, just find one." I turned to the Millers. "Tom, Sarah, I need you to rally the other gardeners. The ones who lost their tomatoes, their zucchini, their prize-winning marigolds. We need witnesses. We need a crowd. We need public opinion on our side." Finally, I looked at Brenda. Her eyes were wide, a mix of fear and something else. Excitement. "Brenda, I need you to be our moral compass. You are the heart of this operation. When I start to think this is a crazy, stupid idea that's going to get me arrested, I need to be able to look at you and remember the petunias. Can you do that for me?" Brenda sniffled, straightened her back, and a look of steely resolve I had never seen before came over her face. She nodded firmly. "For the petunias," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "The council was in agreement. The plan was insane, probably illegal in several states, and most definitely a violation of at least a dozen HOA bylaws. It was, in other words, perfect. As if on cue, Dave, who had been tapping furiously on his laptop since I'd said the words fire engine, gasped. "Leo, you are not going to believe this." He turned the laptop around. "The city of Northwood, 2 towns over, is having a surplus vehicle and equipment auction. Online. It ends tomorrow." He clicked a link, and a new page loaded. And guess what's on the block? There on the screen, in all its grainy, low-resolution glory, was a picture of a fire engine. It was old, a bit boxy, and unapologetically red. The headline read, "Lot Hash 47, 1992 Spartan Gladiator Pumper Truck." My heart skipped a beat. It was destiny. So, there are certain things you never expect to shop for online. A plutonium core, a black market kidney, a life-sized statue of Nicolas Cage made entirely of cheese. As of that afternoon, I could officially add 1992 Spartan Gladiator Pumper Fire Engine to that list. I was sitting in my home office with Dave. The two of us huddled around my laptop like we were trying to defuse a bomb, staring at the auction page. The description was brief and to the point. "Runs good, some cosmetic wear. Pump serviced last year." The picture, however, told a more complex story. It was a story that said, "I have definitely seen some things. I have responded to at least one catastrophic tire fire, and I may have been driven through a wall at some point in the late 90s. "This is it, man," Dave breathed, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "Our chariot of justice, our big red harbinger of reckoning." "It looks like it's one bad pothole away from turning into a pile of rust and faded dreams, Dave," I said, squinting at the image. "Are you sure it's up to the task? Does it even have a pump? Or is that just a big red box for storing fire hats?" Dave zoomed in on the spec sheet, his finger tracing the lines of text. "It has a Hale 1500 GPM pump. Leo, that's gallons per minute. I did some quick calculations. The garden is, what, 500 square feet, and maybe half a foot deep with water? That's about 1,800 gallons of Carol's spite water. This thing, this beautiful beast, could drain it in a minute and 12 seconds. The math was intoxicating. The sheer, overwhelming power of it was a siren song. The logistics, however, were terrifying. "Okay," I said, leaning back in my chair and steepling my fingers. "First problem, money. What's the current bid?" $4,500, Dave said. "The high bidder is a user named Scrapyard_Steve. Scrapyard Steve, I repeated grimly. Our nemesis. He probably wants to melt her down and turn her into rebar. We can't let that happen." What followed was a quick, hilarious, and surprisingly effective fundraising montage. I became a telemarketer for justice, calling the other gardeners whose plots had been turned into swampland. My pitch to Tom Miller went something like this. "Tom, hey, it's Leo. Quick question. How do you feel about making a short-term, high-risk investment in some heavy-duty, mobile water displacement equipment with significant emotional returns?" To my astonishment, it worked. People were angry. They wanted payback. Within an hour, we had cobbled together a war chest of nearly $7,000, pledged via a hastily created GoFundMe page Dave set up called the Petunia Avenger Fund. Brenda, bless her heart, came over and handed me a crisp $50 bill she'd been saving for new garden gnomes. "I want you to use this for the cause," she'd said, with the gravity of a wartime bond drive. Money secured, we faced our next hurdle. Neither of us knew the first thing about buying, let alone operating, a fire engine. "We need a consultant," I said. "Who do we know who understands big, loud, complicated things and has a healthy disrespect for authority?" Dave and I looked at each other and said the name at the same time. Gus. Gus was the grumpy septuagenarian at the end of the block. He was a retired firefighter, a fact we knew because he wore a Northwood Fire Dept retired, still playing with fire t-shirt every single day, rain or shine. His lawn was immaculate, and his primary hobby appeared to be polishing a single, pristine lawn gnome with a stern expression. We found him doing just that. We laid out the entire story: the sunflowers, Carol's rage, the great watering, and our audacious plan. He listened silently, not saying a word, just stroking his chin and occasionally glancing at his gnome as if for guidance. When we finished, he squinted at us. "So, let me get this straight. You two knuckleheads want to buy a fire truck, on the internet, to suck some mud out of a flower bed? Because some broad went nuts with a garden hose?" "That's the gist of it, yes," I said. Gus was silent for a long moment. Then, a slow, crackling smile spread across his weathered face. "That's the stupidest, most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my 72 years on this earth." He set his polishing rag down. "I'm in. But if I'm doing this, I'm doing it right. I'm wearing my helmet." Gus became our technical advisor. We brought my laptop over to his porch, and he peered at the online photos of old Bessie. "She's a Spartan," he said with a knowing nod. "Good bones, solid chassis, and that Hale pump. That's a workhorse. She'll do the job, all right. She's got soul." The auction was set to end at 5 p.m. The final 10 minutes were as tense as any action movie climax. It was me, Dave, and Gus, huddled around the laptop on his porch, watching the countdown timer. Scrapyard_Steve was relentless. Every time we placed a bid, he'd come back a minute later with a higher one. The price climbed from $5,000 to $6,000, then to $6,500. We were nearing the top of our budget. "He's just going to tear her apart for scrap," Gus growled, his fists clenched. "He doesn't see her soul. She's a noble machine." With 30 seconds left, we were the high bidders at $6,700. Our max was $6,850, our entire fund, including Brenda's gnome money. At the 10-second mark, the screen refreshed. New high bid, $6,800 by Scrapyard_Steve. "Damn it," I hissed. "Go all in," Gus said, his voice quiet but firm. "Use Brenda's 50, for the gnomes." I typed in our final bid, $6,850. My finger hovered over the button. I clicked. The screen refreshed. We were the high bidders. The countdown: 5, 4, 3. My heart was in my throat. 2, 1. The screen flashed green. A loud digital gavel sound effect played through the laptop speakers. "Sold to user Petunia_Avenger69. We erupted in cheers. We jumped up and down on Gus's porch. We had done it. We, 3 suburban idiots, now owned a fire engine. In the midst of our celebration, a sudden, sobering thought washed over me like a bucket of ice water. I stopped my victory dance and turned to Dave, my eyes wide with dawning horror. "Hey, Dave," I said slowly. "Where exactly are we going to park a 30-foot-long, 18-ton fire engine?" Dave's face paled. The triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. "My driveway," he said weakly, "has a slight incline." The thrill of victory was immediately, hilariously, replaced by the cold, hard reality of suburban logistics. We had won the battle, but now we had to figure out how to smuggle our spoils of war past enemy lines. The sound of a vintage fire engine being scraped along the side of a suburban garage at 2 o'clock in the morning is not, I repeat, not a subtle sound. It's a multi-ton metallic screech that travels. It's a sound that says, "Hello, neighbors. I know you were sleeping peacefully, but have you ever considered the long-term consequences of my terrible life choices?" Every agonizing shriek of metal on stucco was another nail in the coffin of our supposedly stealthy operation. Old Bessie had arrived on the back of a flatbed tow truck that looked almost as old as she did. The driver, A massive guy named Earl, who was sweating profusely despite the cool night air, was a master of his craft. But this was a unique challenge. "I've towed Lambos out of ditches in Beverly Hills and semis out of cornfields in Iowa," Earl grunted, yanking on a massive lever. "This is the first time I've been asked to parallel park a fire station in a driveway designed for a Prius." Me, Dave, and Gus were standing on the lawn, directing him with frantic, useless hand gestures like a dysfunctional ground crew trying to land a 747. "Angle it! Angle it to the left!" Gus yelled, his voice a gravelly bark. "You're gonna clip the primary intake valve." "I don't know what that is," Earl yelled back. With a final gut-wrenching lurch and the sound of splintering wood, the fire engine settled into Dave's driveway. It had taken out a small but significant section of his prize-winning rose bushes. Dave winced as if he'd felt the pain himself. We paid Earl, who just shook his head, pocketed the cash, and drove off into the night without another word, leaving us alone with our giant, red, rose-bush murdering baby. She was so much bigger up close, and so much redder. She took up the entire driveway, a crimson behemoth sleeping under the pale glow of a street lamp. Working together, the three of us managed to push her back just far enough that we could barely get the garage door to close. The front bumper was essentially kissing the inside of the door, causing it to bulge outwards in a way that was definitely noticeable. We stood there, panting and covered in grease, admiring our purchase. And that's when the headlights swept across the house. A police car. It cruised slowly down the street and pulled up directly to the curb in front of Dave's house. My blood ran cold. Officers Miller and Rodriguez got out. Miller, the older of the two, had a look of permanent, bone-deep exhaustion. Rodriguez, his younger partner, looked more curious than anything else, his eyes scanning the scene. "Evening, gentlemen," Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He gestured with his flashlight toward the mangled rose bushes. "Getting a bit of a late start on your landscaping?" I tried to sound casual, like a man who definitely didn't have an 18-ton emergency vehicle hidden in his friend's garage. "Evening, officer. Just a little late-night gardening project. You know how it is. The weeds, they never sleep." "Right," Miller said, clearly not buying it. "We got a noise complaint," Rodriguez chimed in, consulting his notepad. "Said it sounded like a Decepticon giving birth." That's a direct quote from the caller. I didn't have to ask who the caller was. "Ah, that," I said, thinking fast. "That would be Dave's new, server rack for his Bitcoin farm. He's mining Bitcoin, makes a terrible racket when it's booting up." Dave, bless his quick-thinking heart, nodded vigorously. "The cooling fans are incredibly aggressive," he added, with a solemnity that was almost believable. "It's a new quantum-cooled system, very powerful." Miller shone his flashlight beam on Dave's garage door. It lingered on the distinct, bumper-shaped bulge. "That's a big server rack," he said, his tone still perfectly flat. "It's top of the line," I said, digging the hole deeper. "From, Germany. They're very efficient, the Germans, and large." Miller just stared at us for a long, silent moment. He knew we were lying. We knew he knew we were lying. We were all participants in this little theater of the absurd. He was just too tired, I think, to do the mountain of paperwork that would be involved in discovering the actual truth. "Right," he finally sighed, turning back toward his car. "Well, try to keep your German Bitcoin farming quiet. Some of us are trying to sleep before we have to deal with whatever fresh hell Carol Albright thinks up for us tomorrow." They got back in their car and drove away. The three of us collectively exhaled a breath we didn't realize we'd been holding. The next day, while Gus was giving old Bessie a thorough checkup and cooing over her engine like a proud father, I moved on to the second part of the plan. It wasn't enough to drain the garden. We had to be ready to rebuild it instantly. We needed to erase all evidence of the flood and replace it with a symbol of our victory. I found an ad in the local paper for a landscaping company with the slogan, "No job too weird." I dialed the number. A friendly voice answered. "Mike's Landscaping, Mike speaking." "Hi, Mike. My name is Leo. I have a slightly unusual project for you, and I'm hoping your slogan is accurate." "Try me," he said. "Last week I had to build a custom wheelchair-accessible ramp for a 90-pound sulcata tortoise named Sheldon. I'm pretty much unshockable." "Excellent. I need a crew on standby. We're about to stage what I'm calling a rapid dewatering event. Afterwards, we'll need the works. New topsoil, new timber for the raised beds, sod for the pathways. It's for the Harmony Creek Community Garden." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a chuckle. "Wait, you mean the one that crazy HOA lady turned into a mud pit yesterday? Dude, I saw the pictures on the town's Facebook page. It's legendary. My mom shared it." "That's the one," I confirmed. "There's just one catch. The payment might be unconventional, but I can guarantee the publicity will be fantastic." Mike laughed out loud now. "You're the fire engine guy, aren't you? Someone posted in the comments that you guys were planning something big." News travels terrifyingly fast in the suburbs. "Maybe," I said cautiously. "Dude!" Mike exclaimed. "My crew will be there, free of charge. Consider it a community service. We'll even bring the good sod. My dad lives in your neighborhood, and that woman and the HOA have been a thorn in his side for years. They fined him $100 for having a non-period appropriate welcome mat. A welcome mat. Just tell us when. We wouldn't miss this for the world." I hung up the phone, a wide grin on my face. The pieces were falling into place. We had the machine. We had the veteran operator. We'd had our first and hopefully last brush with the law. And now we had the builders. The only thing left to do was set the stage for the main event.